Welcome to This Day in His Story, created by American Heritage Worldwide. A reminder that every day holds something new to learn. Did you know that Parley P. Pratt and Oliver Cowdery traveled nearly 1,500 miles on foot and by boat in harsh winter conditions to teach the gospel to the Native Americans who were relocated west of Missouri? Join them as they walked from Sandusky to Cincinnati, Ohio, teaching and leaving 2 copies of the Book of Mormon with the Wyandot Indians.
We are diving into a story of just incredible endurance and maybe some accidental diplomacy. It's a pivotal moment in American religious history that starts with a 1,500-mile walk.
In the absolute worst conditions imaginable.
Exactly. Forget what you might think about early pioneer treks. This was undertaken in the brutal winter of 1830 to 1831. We're talking long before roads, long before any real infrastructure, all for a singular religious purpose.
It's a period that gets overlooked, I think, but it really set a foundational precedent for the entire Latter-day Saint movement. What we're examining today is the Lamanite mission.
And it's a remarkable study in human will colliding with, well, what seems like logistical impossibility on the literal western edge of the United States. So our sources for this deep dive are powerful. We're pulling from historical excerpts, journal entries, and personal accounts that detail the whole thing, the origins, the execution of this monumental journey.
And our goal for you, the listener, is to really extract the sheer physical determination these missionaries showed, and also, maybe more surprisingly, the sophisticated diplomatic strategy they used once they actually got there.
Right. This is your shortcut to understanding how early American geopolitical realities, and, specifically the U.S. government's relocation of Native American tribes, directly shaped the spiritual and geographical focus of this new faith.
It's an amazing insight into how commitment translates into logistical ingenuity.
Okay, let's start with the basics. The key figures here include 2 prominent leaders, Oliver Cowdery and Parley P. Pratt, and a few others. They start in Fayette, New York, their destination, Independence, Missouri.
And they arrived on January 13th, 1831.
Now, when you hear Independence, Missouri in that era, you should not be thinking of a modern Midwestern city.
No, not at all. You should picture the absolute end of the line. Independence, Missouri in 1831 was the geopolitical western frontier of the United States.
And the mission's entire purpose was driven by that location?
It was. The missionaries were heading out to share their message with Native American tribes, whom they called Lamanites, who had just been relocated to the lands just west of Missouri.
By the U.S. government?
Yes, during that very same fall and winter. So the timing wasn't an accident. The destination was literally dictated by U.S. Indian policy.
And the sources make it clear that the journey itself was, well, a multi-stage nightmare. They didn't just point west and walk 1,500 miles straight.
No, but every single leg of it was grueling.
So what details really stand out about the scale of their physical sacrifice?
Well, the initial phase already showed this incredible focused commitment. They walked from Sandusky to Cincinnati, Ohio. And that was for a specific reason. They wanted to sort of prepare the Wyandot Indians for their message before they pushed further west.
So they were already thinking strategically, trying to build some momentum.
Absolutely. And that initial contact with the Wyandot seems to have been a huge psychological boost, something they really, really needed before heading into the true wilderness.
It was a crucial validation for them.
It was. Elder Pratt actually wrote that the Wyandots rejoiced in the tidings, bid us Godspeed, and desired us to write to them. So imagine getting that kind of encouragement. It gives you the strength to face what's coming next.
They then board a steamboat 5 days before Christmas in Cincinnati. They're heading for St. Louis.
Right.
That sounds, almost comfortable.
A brief interlude, maybe.
Yeah.
But St. Louis was the end of any kind of reliable transit.
Right.
Once they get off that boat in St. Louis, the real test begins. They still had over 300 miles to go to reach Independence, and they had to do it on foot.
In the dead of winter.
In the dead of winter.
And this is where the commitment level just becomes something else. They carried their belongings, their clothes, books, a little bit of food in knapsacks. And when you read the accounts of what they ate...
Oh, it tells you everything. The desperation of their diet.
What was it specifically?
The sources are very specific. For a month and a half, as they walked those 300 miles, the only food they ate was frozen cornbread and raw pork.
Frozen cornbread and raw pork. I cannot imagine the relentless discomfort, the low-grade, constant suffering of walking 300 miles on that diet.
It wasn't just poor nutrition. It was a constant battle against physical collapse. It speaks to the utter lack of infrastructure, of resources,
They were totally dependent on what they could carry.
There's a quote from Pratt, isn't there? It really brings the suffering home.
It does. He painted this visceral picture of what they were facing every single day. He wrote, "We were without a house or fire, the bleak northwest wind always blowing in our faces with a keenness which would almost take the skin off."
Wow, take the skin off.
That kind of persistent exposure, that wind chill for 300 miles over 6 weeks, it's barely surviving. This wasn't just a tough hike. It was an endurance test that, frankly, few today could even contemplate.
All driven by the need to deliver a message to people they believed were their spiritual kin. So after all that physical misery, they finally reached the western boundary of Missouri, new independence. Their first miracle must have just been shelter.
Shelter was definitely step one. They were able to take up temporary residence at the home of a Colonel Robert Patterson. But, the mission didn't end just because they arrived.
And this brings us to a fascinating part of the story that grounds this whole spiritual effort in real-world practicality.
Exactly. This is where the deep dive gets really interesting.
After surviving the frontier, their first priority wasn't preaching. It was survival. And survival, surprisingly, required a sewing machine.
Precisely. While they waited for the weather to get better and for the right opportunity to engage the Native American leaders, two of the group, Peter Whitmer and Ziba Peterson, they temporarily opened a tailor shop in Independence.
A tailor shop. That must have felt like a huge pivot. Was there any, recorded tension between this very worldly money-making effort and their sacred mission?
The sources don't treat it as a conflict. They treat it as a necessity. It was simply logistical genius.
They needed capital.
They need capital. Bottom line. By having Whitmer and Peterson run the tailor shop, they generated revenue to sustain themselves and, critically, it freed up the other three.
Oliver Cowdery, Parley P. Pratt, and Frederick G. Williams.
Right. It let them focus solely on the primary objective, preaching and making contact.
It's just a great showcase of that blend of faith and, raw frontier self-sufficiency. So with that financial stability, the core group could then focus on diplomacy. The sources point to a crucial contact they pursued. William Anderson, the aged chief of the Delaware tribe.
Chief Anderson was a key target. And the sources note his unique background. He was the son of a Scandinavian father and an Indian mother.
So that mixed heritage meant he was probably more accustomed to navigating different cultural viewpoints.
Potentially making him more receptive to a new message coming from outside the traditional tribal structures, yeah.
And Oliver Cowdery's method of engaging him and the other tribal leaders was, well, it was sophisticated. He wasn't relying on fire and brimstone. He was using empathy and history.
He was a genuine diplomat. Cowdery's strategy was to lead with an acknowledgement of the leader's current plight. He spoke openly about the painful reality that their numbers and possessions were once great, but now
they were small.
They were small, due to expansion and relocation.
That immediately establishes a bond of trust, a mutual recognition of suffering. He wasn't there to preach down to them.
No, he was there as someone who recognized their struggle. And then he leveraged his own hardship. He recounted the long, brutal trip he and his companions had just endured specifically to reach them.
That's a brilliant rhetorical strategy. He's proving his sincerity through shared hardship before he even gets to the doctrine.
And it worked. It allowed him to be invited to speak before a sizable group of about 40 tribal leaders, a formal high-stakes meeting.
And his message was custom-tailored for them. He skillfully wove the narrative of the Book of Mormon into their ancestral history. He presented it not as a new foreign religion, but as a rediscovery of their own heritage.
By connecting the sacred text directly to their lineage, he gave them a framework for understanding it. He then promised that by receiving the counsel in the book, they would unlock many rich blessings.
What was the immediate outcome?
It was positive. Chief Anderson expressed gratitude for their kindness. He accepted the books they brought, especially for those among the Delaware people who can read.
So gaining the acceptance of a major tribal chief must have spurred them on to think bigger.
It did. It made them move beyond personal contact toward official, recognized interaction with the U.S. government.
Right. They sought official sanction for what were really ambitious plans. This led to Oliver Cowdery writing a very important letter on February 14, 1831, sent directly to William Clark.
And that name is so important for context. This is the William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Of course.
He was now the Indian agent for the Louisiana Territory. Clark was the critical federal gatekeeper for all interactions, trade, settlement, everything on the western frontier. Writing to him was aiming for the highest authority you could, outside of the president himself.
So what were they actually asking Clark for in that letter? It wasn't just permission to preach, was it?
Oh no, their plan was much more comprehensive. Cowdery's letter explained he represented a church from New York, and he outlined two explicit practical objectives. First, they wanted to establish schools for the instruction of the Indian children.
Okay, that's a big step.
And second, they also wanted to teach their elders the Christian religion.
That requests schools and religious instruction. That signals a long-term plan. They're thinking about cultural integration, permanent settlement, building a community on the frontier.
Absolutely. Which requires massive logistical support, which Clark, as the Indian agent, would have controlled. It shows the ambitious, wide-ranging vision they had.
But that ambition quickly ran up against the logistical limits of the time.
It did. Parley P. Pratt returned east shortly after to report on the mission's progress and, just as important, to get more copies of the Book of Mormon. They desperately needed them for their proposed schools.
Meanwhile, the missionaries who stayed behind were dreaming even bigger. The sources say they heard reports of a large, industrious Navajo tribe.
Living about 300 miles west of Santa Fe.
I mean, that's pushing the frontier even further into completely uncharted territory.
A truly daunting prospect. But despite that expansive ambition, the sources are clear. The initial scope of the mission had to be abandoned. The distances, the sheer lack of resources. It meant they couldn't continue their attempts to reach the Navajo at that time.
So, on the surface, the mission was a failure in its immediate far western goal. They didn't convert the tribes, they didn't make it to the Navajo.
Right.
But the real significance isn't in the failure of that western push, it's in the immediate organizational ripple effect it had back east.
Exactly. This small, brutal exploration was a massive catalyst. I mean, think about the timeline. Within months of this mission ending and Pratt's return, there were suddenly more church members in Ohio than in the original headquarters in New York.
The knowledge they gained from this mission, the reality of the frontier, the strategic importance of that western border, it shifted the entire focus of the movement. Ohio was quickly designated as the new gathering place, the new headquarters of the church.
And this movement wasn't random. This journey solidified a key foundational idea that dictated their future. The place of Zion had already been indicated to be on the borders by the Lamanites. By traveling to Independence, the missionaries confirmed the location of that crucial border.
So that gave the organization the context they needed to establish a closer, more stable gathering place in Kirtland, Ohio.
To prepare for the inevitable future movement back to that defined western border.
In a way, the Western journey actually pushed the entire movement temporarily eastward. It let them consolidate, gather resources, and build the organizational strength they would need for the massive migrations that came later.
It transformed the organization from a small New York faith into a movement with defined geographical and spiritual goals, all centered around that western frontier experience.
Okay, let's quickly pull together the core takeaways of this deep dive for you, the listener. First, you have to remember the sheer endurance required. 1,500 miles, 6 weeks of frozen cornbread and raw pork, battling that merciless northwest wind. That physical sacrifice defines their early commitment.
Second, highlight the diplomatic sophistication. The way Cowdery bypassed simple doctrine and appealed directly to the shared history and acknowledged suffering of Chief Anderson and the Delaware tribe. He leveraged hardship to gain trust.
And finally, recognize that this seemingly small, short-lived effort on the western frontier, the one that never even reached the Navajo, was the exact organizational trigger that immediately shifted the church's headquarters and focus eastward to Ohio. It allowed the movement to scale and prepare for what was coming.
This whole mission really underscores the principle that sharing an important message requires not just faith, but personal responsibility and immense sacrifice. Whether it's surviving on frozen cornbread or pausing your spiritual work to run a tailor shop to pay the bills.
Which raises an important question for us to leave you with, especially when we think about how ideas and information spread today. If this early, incredibly difficult mission, which was, abandoned in its initial goal, was still instrumental enough to fundamentally define the entire organizational structure of a global faith? What ongoing responsibility does the act of sharing knowledge or any significant message impose on those who follow?
The initial sacrifice kind of sets the ultimate bar for the successful application of knowledge. What are you willing to endure to ensure the message you believe in reaches its intended audience?
Something for you to mull over until our next deep dive. Thank you for joining us for this day in His story. May the lessons of yesterday inspire you to see God's hand today and to play your part in His story now. For more faith-based learning, visit ahsworldwide.org, the homeschool for faith and family.